Like so many good stories, this one takes place in the 1980s at first. It's the 80s. It's MTV when the little astronaut and the moon when they showed like actual music videos. It's Ghostbusters. It's Indiana Jones, right? It's E.T. It's a time in which we had things like Pac-Man, right? And when we had Donkey Kong, when we had Atari, and television and ColecoVision. And it's also a time when a tabletop game, was gaining a tremendous amount of popularity, surging in interest. And that game, of course, is Dungeons and Dragons. This is a picture of my own personal collection, a small, very small fraction of my own personal collection. Dungeons & Dragons was not invented in the 1980s. It was invented in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, but by the 80s, it had taken off. And for people like me, it was just absolutely fantastic. I remember when I first got my red box set of Dungeons & Dragons. This came one winter night, Christmas Eve. My uncle got it for me, and I never looked back. I absolutely adored the game. I've been playing it for the remainder of my life. Now, it turns out that not everyone, even though the game has been around for decades, not everyone, this makes me a little sad, but it's true, not everyone knows what Dungeons & Dragons is about. So I will point to Gary Gygax himself, the inventor of Dungeons & Dragons. He gives us a little bit of an idea of what it is in the introduction to the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. But roughly, what made this such an interesting game is it didn't have edges, and by that I mean it wasn't a board. You sat down at a table with your friends. Most people took on the role of an individual character, right? And it was all borrowed from tropes involving fantasy characters from Tolkien, swords and wizardry, this sort of thing. So you were a rogue, you were a warrior, you were a spellcaster, and you had a sheet in front of you, and the sheet would give you information about what your character could do and what your character couldn't do. There was a set of rules to resolve some things, and then there was this other person, the dungeon master, and she or he would invent a world and invent certain scenarios, a dungeon to explore. And a lot of it was talking back and forth. You know, I want to go here, I don't want to go there. And the Dungeon Master would then help resolve certain things through a set of die rolls. And so it was a tremendous amount of fun. We all had a great time with it. But something else started happening in the 1980s with Dungeons and Dragons. And that was the Satanic Panic, or the moral panic. Believe it or not, in the 1980s, Dungeons & Dragons came under scrutiny, a lot of scrutiny, as the sort of game that would lead to physical harm and moral ruin. And this was not just found in some small towns across the United States. There ended up being a 60 Minutes episode about this. There ended up being a movie called Mazes and Monsters, starring, of all people, Tom Hanks, about this. There was a little pamphlet from Jack Chick, notoriously called Dark Dungeons, that was supposed to show a lot of terrible things that were happening. You had people who were professionals saying that the content of this game was really problematic, and this satanic moral panic ended up hitting home for me. Literally hometown, right? I grew up in Chardon, Ohio. It's a small town east of Cleveland, population 5,000. One day as a kid, in the 1980s, I see pamphlets going around saying that there's going to be a town discussion about Dungeons & Dragons in the basement of the library. At least they got the basement part right, because most Dungeons & Dragons playing took place in parents' basement, right? So, all right, we're going to be in the basement. And I went there, and it was just a spectacular moment. There was a psychiatrist who was sharing her stories about how she was absolutely convinced that some of the cases that she saw of people who wanted to kill themselves were wanting to kill themselves because of Dungeons and Dragons. There was a police officer dressed as a police officer with a gun and a badge, saying that he had gone to arrest someone on drug charges, and when he went to arrest this person was playing Dungeons and Dragons, and when he then went to make the actual arrest, this person seemed to reveal supernatural power. And the only thing I could think is, I'm playing this game wrong. And I want to start playing it like that, right? Maybe I read too many comic books as well. But none of this rang true with the lived experience of this game. I mean, it's a bunch of geeks sitting around, drinking Mountain Dew, eating Doritos, fighting over who got the last Oreo. The content of the game, I was a dungeon master often, and my players would spend 45 minutes arguing about whether to listen to a door or not. Do you want to listen to the door? I don't know if I want to listen to the door. What if it's trapped? Well, if it's trapped, someone should look for the traps. Well, wait a minute, I'm not going to look for the traps. This is the content of the game. It was still awesome. I probably didn't describe it right then as sounding awesome, but it was still awesome. All right, so at that moment in the basement of the library of my hometown, I stood up and said that I would devote my life to showing the goodness that Dungeons & Dragons brings into the world. That's absolutely not true, right? I mean, that's what was going on in my head at the moment, but I was still really young and completely intimidated. But it turns out that I found myself decades later in a profession where I could demonstrate that this game gives us some interesting insights that can help us make people better moral agents, and that's what I want to turn to now. So I am a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and my job is to help teach ethics in an impactful and meaningful way for professionals to find ways to make ethics sticky. And so common ethics pedagogy, when you take a look at it, is mostly some back and forth between theory and cases. So some courses lean pretty heavily on theory. You know, we're going to go through it all. We're going to go through consequentialism, deontology, John Rawls, and so forth, and maybe just do a little bit of dabbling with cases. Others lean in hard on cases. Let's look at protagonists in these situations and seeing what they're doing. But it's typically this back and forth. However, I recognize that there was much merit in the movement to add more experiential learning into the classroom. Experiential learning not just being generally active learning. I think classrooms and ethics can have active learning when you just have people, you know, engaging in the Socratic method back and forth, talking to each other in small groups about what's going on. But experiential learning, the kinds of things that you get with simulations. And so, you know, I wanted to add simulations into this cycle where you can have students engage in some kind of an activity that's not just analyzing a case or not just, you know, consuming theory, and come out of that with some really, really interesting insights about their own moral character and about how they want to navigate the world. The challenge that I found is that standard simulations worked in great ways for teaching things like negotiations or leadership and so forth. It wasn't entirely useful for what I wanted to do in ethics. So a typical simulation is one where participants are given roles, and sometimes those roles are fairly tight. You're supposed to, you know, you like this person, you don't like that person, here's your goal, here's what you're supposed to do. You use simulations to develop skills. Sometimes, as I said, they're leadership and negotiation skills. Professionals sometimes go through live simulations to make sure that they can help in emergency situations. There is an ethical dimension that I've seen in some simulations where you take on a wholly different perspective. You get inside the skin of someone else, and you use that to build your ability to understand how different people think about the world and see the world. And I thought all that was fine and well, but I wanted to do something different. One of the things I found happening with my students, especially when they looked at cases, is they would look at this case. It was, you know, often a real case, not just an imaginative one. And when going through the case, they would always imagine themselves as the protagonist, acting heroically. Right? I recognize that from my Dungeons & Dragons playing as well, right? But they would always, they would never have made the mistakes that these other individuals have made. And look, that's a very natural disposition to have, right? We all sort of want to think about ourselves as acting heroically in these sorts of situations. I wanted to put students into situations where we got to test that. We got to see, well, what would you actually do in some of these things without really putting them into a situation where there's high-stakes ethics in play. So what I ended up doing is stepping back and thinking about some of the general design principles from Dungeons & Dragons, because it turns out that in a lot of Dungeons & Dragons gameplay, you end up thinking about ethical issues. You end up doing things that I thought would be extraordinarily useful to bring into the classroom. And so here are some abstractions of gameplay from Dungeons & Dragons that I wanted to then use to design ethics simulations. One is you confront scenarios where there's no clear line of authority on how to make a decision, right? And so the thought here is you can't just say, wow, this is a really tough issue. Who should be the person that is answering this? It's up to you. So someone has to figure out how to go about answering this thing. Roles are assigned, but they're minimal. In old school Dungeons & Dragons, you know, you were a fighter, you were wizard, whatever. You had some invented personality, but mostly it was you. The decision-making, the rest of it was entirely on you. You couldn't hide behind this being an exercise in acting. That has changed a little bit in the years since the original game came out, but I like that old school feature of it. There's a simple set of rules that can adapt to any sort of course of decision that's made. You know, it's not choose your own adventure. Dungeons & Dragons is not choose your own adventure. You know, if you go this way, turn to page 5. If you go this way, turn to page 25. Really, it's very open-ended. You can end up doing whatever you want, and the rules will help resolve whatever it is that you do. All right, so participants must cope with ongoing uncertainty. There's those dice. And this is something that I found, especially in simulations, that a lot of simulations did not build into them, which is uncertainty. Not arbitrariness, uncertainty. You always know that when you make a decision, there's going to have to be a roll of the die that's going to determine what actually happens. And you can play the odds a little bit, but at the end of the day, you have to live with the consequences of what the dice say. And last is that you have to establish most of the goals. You know, this is a running joke when people who are just learning about Dungeons & Dragons, they say, well, you know, who won? There's not winning in Dungeons & Dragons. Really, you play just to keep on playing. You play to have your characters advance and so forth and so on. If you want more goals than that, you have to put them in play. They don't come by way of the game. So what I want to take you through now briefly is an example of a simulation that I built using these design principles. And the simulation is called Patient Zero, a game of ethics, leadership, and negotiation. And the first thing I want to mention is that this is inspired by a lot of the design of Dungeons & Dragons, but it's importantly different in some respects. So what happens is I get, and I typically do this in professional schools like the Harvard Kennedy School. I've done it at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I've done it at the School of Business. I've done it at the Harvard Extension School. And so you get individuals into groups of about 5. And there are simulation managers. We call them simulation managers, not dungeon masters, for what I hope are completely obvious reasons. And they have been trained with me on how to do the work that a dungeon master would do in these sorts of things. But you have groups of individuals at tables, let's say 5 or 7 individuals, and the first task that we give them is to create a country. So this is a simulation where rather than handing them, hey, you're Brazil, right? Hey, you're the United States and so forth, it's no, you've got to actually invent your own country. Some of that is done with just decisions right on the ground, and some of that is done through the rolling of dice. And so the first thing that we get is buy-in because the country is created right there on the spot. It is the player character in the simulation, this country, co-created by individuals, somewhat randomly and somewhat by decisions that are made. And the country has attributes like ability scores that I consider to be the sort of core features of a country. What's the country's economy like? What's its infrastructure like? Military, institutions, and health. And again, what you end up getting is some distribution and choices here based on what the group decides is most important and also what happened with the dice roll. So some groups will roll very well and have a nice pool of points to distribute amongst these things. Others won't. It's always interesting to see what happens when the first dice roll made is a bad one and you have a team that's like, ugh, because we're going to have to go through the simulation with a country that's already a little bit hobbled. But that happened in Dungeons & Dragons too with some characters. So just to give you an idea, when you distribute points across these various attributes, what we do is we give individuals a chart like this that helps explain what the numbers are supposed to mean. So it's, you know, there's a level of abstraction, but we don't want it to be too abstract. It's kind of crazy to just say to someone, hey, you know, do you want a 1, a 2, a 3, or 0 military? The right response to that at first is, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? But here with this, you get an idea of what the numbers end up meaning narratively in the simulation. All right, and then we get we give some choices to them so that they can help really build their country from the ground up. What kind of government do you want to have? What's the environment of your country like? The cuisine, obviously the most important one, right? The cuisine. Tourist sites, but you would be amazed, right? And again, this is modeled off of some Dungeons & Dragons, you know, character development. There's the core abilities, and that's really important. But then there's the things that's sometimes called fluff that ends up really playing an important role as you move on. And we also ask participants to decide 2 things that are true of their country. It doesn't mean that the others are false, but these are the things that are really important and, in some sense, identity forming for their country. What is your country essentially like? You know, do you have constitutionally guaranteed rights? Is there homogeneity in religious beliefs, et cetera, et cetera? So this is a bunch of decisions that are made, and then the team is given a generic role. So I don't spend much time building in details of the role because that's not what the simulation is supposed to be about. They're just a group of high-ranking officials. They're told that they're going to be the closest advisors to their leader. Their leader could be a queen, a king, right? Whatever kind of country that they decided, right? President, prime minister, you get the idea. And they're told that they have to make the best decisions they can under the information constraints and time constraints that they're given. The main dynamic of this simulation is they're given an event. At first, it's an event that everyone has, and then it's the events that the simulation manager gives them. They come up with they think about it, they argue with themselves, they come up with some response, and then there's a resolution, and that resolution involves rolling dice. What is Patient Zero about specifically? Zombies. Yes, I have gotten away with running a 8-hour zombie apocalypse at Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard Business School, Harvard Extension School, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out, though, that a zombie apocalypse is actually a really interesting simulation in that you can model the evolution of pandemics very well with it, and it puts you into that very nice place where you know that absolutely no one sitting down at the table will have had any experience with this whatsoever, right? That's a really interesting and important point, right? I mean, this simulation was designed for people coming from all over the world with all sorts of experience, and I always tell students at the very beginning of this, if you in fact have had experience with the content of the simulation, you should talk to me individually, right? And we'll go from there. So we sit them down, we give them this opening outbreak. The opening outbreak is exactly what you might imagine. There have been rumors about some kind of event. People are cognitively compromised. They're behaving violently. They're not responding to reason or any of these sorts of things. Then we have them make some decisions, and the core mechanic is to roll a couple of six-sided dice and add their country tribute. That's not a Dungeons & Dragons mechanic. It's a mechanic from a different game that I found very useful. The basic way that this unfolds is that if you get a 10 or higher, you got a success. If you get a 7 to 9, you get a success with some complications. If you get a 6 or lower, you fail. Obamacare is the perfect example of a 7 to 9. If you do the math on this, there's going to be a lot of rolls that fall into that range. You succeed, but it's complicated. So you can imagine an Obamacare roll is, what do you want to do? I want to create better health care. Roll, 7 to 9. All right, well, here's the good news. You succeeded. Here's the bad news. It came at tremendous political cost, right? And you're going to be tied up in the courts for a long, long time. That's the kind of complications that you want in these simulations. Success happens, but it's never exactly as clean as you would want it to be. This mechanic is powered by a system called Apocalypse World, and so I want to give credit where credit is due. And so I just want to step back for a minute and say that it's a really fun and exciting experience to do this, and you can move in a couple of different directions based on what you want to do. If you want to take away simulation managers because that's too much, you can do so, but and that will improve scalability. If you want to, on the other side of it, really increase individual roles, you can do that as well. So you can really play with this in a couple of different directions that I think is quite exciting and useful. I think I want to just mention 3 big takeaways. One is simulation should be introduced into ethics pedagogy. I think that Dungeons & Dragons and the games that have been designed in light of Dungeons & Dragons gives us a really good way of thinking about how to do that. And simulations like Patient Zero end up showing us how this can happen in a way where you merge ethics with leadership and negotiation. I've been doing this for years now, and the reason I'm standing in front of you is because there's been overwhelming, not universal, but overwhelming enthusiasm from professionals across the world in running through this. If I have one last thing to say, it's this, and I hope this is obvious. It's certainly not original, but I think it's worth mentioning all the same, and that is that playing and learning are complementary, not incompatible. And it's been a great opportunity to share this with you today, and also to rehabilitate, I hope, the role that Dungeons & Dragons can play in moral reflection. Thank you very much.